And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we are presenting the theme, Crisis of Faith. Our distinguished guest today is Bill Moyers, who needs no introduction. Indeed, it's been my pleasure, Bill. To simply say, welcome to the Bill Moyers Show. You should also note that Bill Moyers' wonderful wife and life partner and professional colleague, Judith Moyers, is here. Judith, I don't see you now, I know you're here, but she will be reading our scripture on Sunday morning. So those of you who are able to join us for worship, you'll hear and see Judith front and center at that time. Let's thank Judith Moyers for her presence. The title of Bill's presentation is Faith, Doubt, and the American Way, and we've been looking forward to this all week. We invite you also to stay here in the Hall of Philosophy for our town hall meeting immediately after Bill's lecture, in which Bill, Shara Babcock, and I, with your help, are going to try to make sense of all that we've heard this week and to bring some sense of closure to this week-long set of conversations and explorations. Finally, we're very grateful to the Eileen and Warren Martin Lectureship for Emerging Studies in Bible and Theology for providing support for this week's Interfaith Lecture Series. We are most delighted that Bill Moyers has been with us all week. We're anxious to hear him today, and I ask you to join me in providing a very warm Chautauqua welcome to Bill Moyers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again for that welcome. The title, Faith, Doubt, and the American Way, has nothing to do with what I'm about to say. That's because I came with a gorgeous prepared speech. Every sentence was beautifully crafted. The symmetry of the arc was perfection. The conclusion would have brought you to your feet with a standing ovation. But so help me, everyone who spoke here this week and everyone I've interviewed stole all my material. I'm serious. All my material. I call them a posse of pagan plagiarists. As the only true believer here, I think that's appropriate. What a week this has been. And Judith and I have been so grateful to be here with you. We've often said that journalism is a continuing course in adult education, our own. And we've been fortunate to share with so many people what we learned from and with you and with other kindred spirits like you. Ours is a medium. We spent most of our adult life in it. Ours is a medium that can work magic by closing the distance between us. Television has made us intimate strangers. And many of you have told me this week that you feel as if you know me, although we have never met. And I can say the same thing about you. Over a half-century of broadcast journalism, I've learned to sense the ties that bind, what you care about, why you watch, and why you don't, and whether we are connecting. And I was moved by so many of you in the last 10 days, graciously stopping me to express appreciation for one or more of those series from the past, say Joseph Campbell and The Power of Myth, The Healing in the Mind on the Impact of Emotions on Health, our series on death and dying, which Judith aptly named On Our Own Terms, because that was the message of it, Faith and Reason, The Wisdom of Faith with Houston Smith, The Power of the Word, or any of the scores of investigative documentaries we have done on corruption in politics or the inequities of our economic system. I say we and our because, as Robert indicated, I didn't produce those programs solo. Perhaps you heard Robert the other night speak admiringly of that marvelous organ in the amphitheater, and then quickly say to Jared Jackson, the organist, "We know it doesn't play by itself." Ditto for me. Pull back the camera and you would see me surrounded by a top-notch team of talent, from producers and directors to researchers and technicians and graphic artists. And when I say our series, our work, I'm talking about that team and one very special woman whom Robert just recognized, my wife, Judith Davidson Moyers. She was for 30 years the president of our independent production company, the producer and executive editor of all we did, the inspiration for some of our most creative work. She's received 4 Emmys, 3 Peabodys, 2 Christopher Medals, and many other awards, including several honorary degrees. She served on many nonprofit boards, including almost 14 years as a trustee of the State University of New York and Union Theological Seminary in New York City, as well as on several corporate boards. She's the mother of our 3 children and grandmother of 5. And I want to say, if any young people are here contemplating matrimony, be sure to choose a mate with whom you can still have a long and interesting conversation every morning on the state of the world and life after 62 years of marriage. Joan Campbell Brown and Albert Pennybacker, I don't think the two of you have anything to worry about on that score. Joan, who directed the Department of Religion here so long, and Albert, who's an old friend of ours, are getting married on the day after the summer season ends, and they've asked me to extend an invitation to all of you to be here and to be their guest at the House of Mission. Congratulations to both of you. Your combined ages and our combined ages would equal over 2/3 of the life of this republic. What a week, as I said. I've often described journalist, as a beachcomber on the shores of other people's knowledge and experience. And I am, to a very real extent, what I gather. This week of beachcombing has yielded an exceptional harvest. From the folks I interviewed here, Robbie Jones, Susan Smith, Greg Epstein, and Sid Schwartz, every one of them took my thinking down a fresh path, and that's true. All I can do for our lecturers is to invoke that ancient Latin word, the only one our grandchildren know, wow. I could keep listening another week and beyond to Teresa Fry Brown, Andrew Sullivan, Alan Cooperman, Caitlin Beatty, Dahlia Lithwick, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and Ivo Patel. I'm just humbled to be last in that all-star lineup. My assignment this afternoon was to bring together the main points that were sounded by these very provocative, very engaging, and very wise speakers. To remind you of the mandate for the week, the institution sent out this notice to us who are going to be participating. Major research organizations such as Pew Research Center and PRRI, that's Robbie Jones' organization, report that religions are undergoing dramatic change, a decline in mainstream Christianity and practicing Judaism, demographic shifts pointing toward a growing Muslim population, and more people than ever, young people in particular, who claim no affiliation with organized religion. Some detect crisis amidst these changes, but in this week we look to the possibilities. What impacts do shifting religious norms mean for other aspects of public life? How are churches and synagogues and mosques reinventing themselves as moral centers of the communities they serve? Together we imagine the future of faith and religion as we come to see it. And as I say, my assignment was to identify the major themes of the week and summarize them for you. Well, I flunked. I can't do it. I've let you down. There are just too many ideas. Even to blink this week was to miss another light bulb going off, a keen insight, a compelling metaphor, a thought worth holding and turning over in your mind again and again. I tried to take notes, but kept suspending my pen just an inch above my notebook because I was mesmerized like a child at the ice cream parlor, confronted with 36 different flavors and wanting to taste each one. That's Chautauqua. With all these lectures and classes and conversations, you have a world of ideas right here on these 750 acres. And I could not possibly do justice to the extraordinary range of ideas this week. Fortunately, the Chautauqua Daily dispatched some fine young reporters among us, and their reportings are substantial and accurate, and you can take copies home with you to refresh yourself with solid reminders of what was said here. What I'm going to do briefly, because the format's been slightly changed in the hope that I can take a few questions here before we get to the next session. And by the way, I left my two thick notebooks with Chautauqua on the front of them at the House of Mission, and I need one. If one of you over there could find it, it's a black notebook with Chautauqua misspelled on the cover. I always get the U and A backwards. What I'm going to do is recall some of the thoughts I entertained, uninvited, as I listened. So it's less a summary than a commentary on what was said here. Some of it is journalistic, some of it's personal. I've tried over the course of my career as a journalist not to be confessional, because I don't think the journalist should get in the way of the story. But every life is a particular life, and faith is so personal and doubt so singularly experienced that I can't talk honestly about our experience together without occasionally speaking as a kindred spirit rather than exclusively as an observer. It was impossible this week for me not to be reminded of the first visit Judith and I made to the great cathedral in Chartres. 60 years ago, this past spring, 1957, I had been in graduate school and she had been teaching in Scotland. And we were heading on a trip across Europe that would carry us over 10,000 miles, 3.5 months, on a budget of $750 for the two of us. After blowing that in Paris, we headed to the medieval city of Chartres, 50 miles, 83 kilometers away. One, as many of you know, one of the world's great sacred destinations and one of the great achievements in the history of architecture. Somewhat overwhelming for a couple of young Southern Baptists from Texas, ages 22 and 21. And of course, we stood for quite a while before those three great rose windows, north, south, and east, for which Chartres is so famous. But as we moved on and turned a corner, we came upon a statue so stunning that it stopped me in my tracks. The artist, thank you, depicts, the reason I want this is that I have the names in there of the people who said they wanted to ask questions today. And I didn't want to be tarred and feathered before leaving here. The artist depicts Adam, the first human in the biblical story of creation, emerging as an idea from God's mind. God was thinking us into being. We were conceived as ideas in the mind of God. I had never before encountered face-to-face so powerful and prescient a metaphor. Because with a beginning like that, we humans cannot avoid thinking for ourselves. It was inevitable that we would argue inside our own head with ourselves But it also means we had to debate with other thinking people the meaning of existence, the purpose of life, the place of values, the nature of freedom, the state of government, and so on. Imagination and choice, the glory and the grief of thinking, imagination and choice came in our DNA. It was so Baptist. There we were in a Roman Catholic church dating back to the 12th century, and I was thinking Baptist thoughts. Just 10 years later, I'd been baptized in the Central Baptist Church in Marshall, Texas on the eve of my 13th birthday. The pastors and teachers in that church informed me that I was entering what was known as the age of accountability. I could make my own choices, should make my own choices, must make my own choices about my relationship with God. The priesthood of the believer was how it was often put, and they insisted no ecclesiastical organization can come between you and God or between you and the Bible. The Bible was the source of our devotional strength and moral guidance, and you were expected to read it and think about it yourself, with, of course, the gentle guidance of your pastor and your teachers. Soul freedom, the right to listen and heed that still small voice inside you, which we call the conscience. Soul freedom meant the right to reject any and all coercion of belief, the right to reject any and all assaults on the intellect and any and all appeals to emotion, the right not to bow your knee to any tyrant, ecclesiastical or political, the right to say no, even to God. And that's the catch. That's what, thinking back on it, I came to understand about the sculpture at the Chartres Cathedral. That if we were brought to life by a thinking God in God's image, we have the power to believe and the power to doubt. Doubt and belief are progenies of God, the Siamese twins of faith. Belief is to assent, doubt is to defy. And that's why Baptists took part in the American Revolution for Independence. That's why they agitated for writing freedom of religion, soul freedom into law. And that's why they agitated with others until the framers included in the Constitution Article 6, which reads, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office in the United States." And just to be safe, they agitated for a Bill of Rights guarantee of the free exercise of religion, and that became the American way. The other day, when we arrived, I went to the library here, a wonderful library, by the way. If you haven't had a chance to visit, do. And as I was working at the computers, I looked up, and across the wall there was a statement, you've probably seen it, by Robert Jackson, who was a self-taught, non-law school graduate who had a distinguished career as a country lawyer over here in Jamestown, New York, and then made his mark later as a justice of the Supreme Court and the chief prosecutor of Nazi war crimes at the Nuremberg trials. Justice Jackson wrote, it's right there on your library. The very purpose of a Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, to establish them as legal principles to be applied to the courts. One's right to life, liberty, and property, to free speech, a free press, freedom of worship and assembly, and other fundamental rights may not be submitted to vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. Freedom of conscience, the still small voice within, is why I remained a Baptist well into my adult life. Now, you must be wondering what prompted him this week to start thinking about a statue he saw 60 years ago in an ancient cathedral in France, and to start talking to himself and now to us about belief, doubt, and the American way. Well, in one of his works, the poet James Weldon Johnson has Gabriel say this, and I think this was the theme of the week. You've asked me what it was. This is what I think it is. Gabriel, in that epic poem, declared everything that's tied down is coming loose. That's certainly what we heard this week. And we started with the numbers, with Robbie Jones and Alan Cooperman reporting that more Americans than ever are unchurched. We learned that young adults 18 to 29 are nearly 4 times as likely to identify as religiously unaffiliated as young adults a generation ago. And that 2/3 of unaffiliated Americans, I'm not sure one of them said this, although it was in their research, 2/3 of unaffiliated Americans today agree that religion causes more problems in society than it solves. We heard from Susan Smith, among others, that the Black Lives Matter does not look to the black church as the leadership model. Those activists sometimes accuse the church, the black church, of sexism, homophobia, and complacency. Young women in the ranks of that movement still resent the fact that their elders try to run the show. The age gap in all churches seems to be widening. You know, I'm aware of how all this adds up. I'm white, male, straight, and old. I understand that any time I stand up before an audience half my age, there's an undercurrent of skepticism, not malicious skepticism, but just generational skepticism. Why are we listening to him? He can't get the world we live in. He served his times, he can't possibly understand ours. I hear them. And I know how difficult it is for those of us who come to Chautauqua in settings like this with people like you to remember how savage and ravaged the world is. This is a beautiful spot. We're in good and compatible company. If there are differences among us, and there are, they're not divisive differences. They're not high walls separating us. And most of us will go home to comfortable, if challenging, lives. Most of what's happening to other people is beyond our experience. And watching it even on television, which in some cases can bring us closer together, if you watch television, it doesn't really close the distance between that reality and our lives here. Something that was said in one of the lectures reminded me that Dennis Johnson died this year. Dennis Johnson was one of our finest writers, although if I ask you if you'd read his books, few hands would go up. In fact, let me pause and ask, how many of you have read a novel by Dennis Johnson? Where did I see it? There. Was it Jesus' Son? Yes, that's his most noted one. When you get home, the rest of you, add it to your reading list. Dennis, D-E-N-I-S, Johnson. When he was asked why he wrote, Dennis Johnson quoted Joseph Conrad. My task, which I'm trying to achieve, is by the power of the written word to make you hear, to make you feel. It is above all else to make you see. That and no more, and it's everything. And so it was. In his own eloquent tribute to Johnson, the New York Times critic, Michiko Kakatani, wrote that Johnson used his startling gift for language to create word pictures as detailed and visionary and as varied as paintings by Edward Hopper and Hieronymus Bosch, capturing the lives of outsiders, the lost, the dispossessed, the damned, and capturing them with empathy and unsparing candor. Whether set in the bars and motels of small-town America, on the streets of wartime Saigon, his stories depict people living on the edge, addicted to drugs or adrenaline or fantasy, reeling from the idiocies and exigencies of modern life and longing for salvation. I suppose some people might look upon those he writes about as the deplorables. But when you read Jesus' Son, you realize they're most likely the people whose company Jesus of Nazareth, the Jewish teacher, seemed to prefer. What was it he said? The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. Jesus said, if you take people to lunch, be sure to include the poor, the crippled. Jesus said, serve the widow. Jesus said, why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Sounds like both our political parties. It goes on and on like that. He would have been at home in Dennis Johnson's books. Here's what Kakatani wrote. Dennis Johnson's America, past or present, is uncannily resonant with America today. This is a troubled land, staggering from wretched excess and aching losses. A country where dreams have often slipped into out-and-out delusions, and people hunger for deliverance, if only in the person of a half-baked Messiah. Reason is in short supply in this America, and grafters and con men peddling conspiracy thinking and fake news abound. Families are fragmented or non-existent, and primal Darwinian urges have replaced the rule of law. And Dennis Johnson himself said, what I write about is really the dilemma of a fallen world, and asking, why is it like this if there's supposed to be a God? When religion can openly and honestly address that language, in language those deplorables can grasp, and we are among them, for we're all blind. We all don't see fully. We all take shortcuts. I do. When religion can address these people, us, and not in the politicized jargon of today's over-televised, over-technologized, and under-tenderized political class, we will not have to fret over the future of faith. Here's something we didn't get to earlier in the week with the numbers. When you go home, I urge you to go to theatlantic.com, the OnLive archive of the Atlantic magazine, which is sometimes breathtaking in its journalism. Last March, one of the magazine's sharpest and most engaged writers wrote this piece, Breaking Faith. Peter Bynett acknowledges what Robbie Jones and Alan Cooperman reported earlier this week here at Chautauqua, that over the past decade, Americans have been fleeing organized religion in increasing numbers. The vast majority still believe in God, whatever form that belief may take, or whichever God appears behind their eyelids when they pray. But the share that rejected any religious affiliation, as you heard, has been growing fast, and among millennials, the figure was 35%. Some observers, Bynett writes, predicted that this new secularism would ease cultural conflict as the country settled into a near consensus on the battle over gay marriage. For example, in 2015, the conservative writer David Brock, noting America's growing detachment from religious institutions, urged social conservatives to put aside a culture war that has alienated the large parts of 3 generations. Beinart disagrees. He says secularism is also making America's partisan clashes more brutal, that it contributed to the rise of Donald Trump and the so-called right movement that Greg Epstein discussed here the other day, whose members see themselves as proponents of white nationalism. Beinart's conclusion is this, that as Americans have left organized religion, they haven't stopped viewing politics as a struggle between us and them. Many, indeed, have come to define us and them, to define us and them in even more primal and irreconcilable ways. Now, here are some statistics we didn't hear earlier this week, although they were in Alan's and Robbie's research. Quote, religious attendance is also down among Republicans. He used research, especially from PRII, that's Robbie's outfit, to reveal that, quote, the percentage of white Republicans with no religious affiliation has nearly tripled since 1990, a shift that obviously helped Trump win the election. Of all the reasons evangelicals voted for Trump, despite his racist and misogynist habits, his predatory business practices, and his violation of more than a slew of the Ten Commandments, despite his history of support for pro-choice and gay rights, according to Jeffrey Lehman of Notre Dame, quoted by Peter Beinart, is this, quote, Trump does best among evangelicals with one key trait. They don't really go to church. He backs that up with a Pew Research Center poll early last year during the Republican primaries. It showed that Trump trailed Ted Cruz, a Southern Baptist with a Baptist father, that Trump trailed Ted Cruz by 15 points among Republicans who attended religious services every week, but he led Cruz by a whopping 27 points among those who did not attend religious services every week. What's going on here? Do these religiously unaffiliated Republicans embrace Trump's bleak view of America more readily than their church-going peers? Has the absence of church made their lives worse? Or are people with troubled lives most likely to stop attending services in the first place? And here comes this stunning revelation, stunning to me, from the University of Virginia sociologist W. Bradford Wilcox. Since the early 1970s, rates of religious attendance have fallen more than twice as much among whites without a college degree as among those who graduated college. And even within the white working class, those who don't regularly attend church are more likely to suffer from divorce, addiction, and financial distress. This is Wilcox speaking. Many conservative Protestant white men who are only nominally attached to a church struggle in today's world. They have traditional aspirations just like any of us. But they have difficulty holding down a job, getting and staying married, and otherwise forging real and abiding ties in their community. The culture and the economy, he says, have shifted in ways that have marooned them with traditional aspirations unrealized in their real world lives. I want to make a quick detour here. As Robert was telling me earlier today, there are 31,105 verses in the Standard Bible, right? Is that the figure? Yes, right. I'm just teasing. There's that many. There's an online outfit, topverses.com, that has ranked every one of those verses using an algorithm, otherwise known as the Holy Spirit. Topverse.com last year analyzed 37 million online Bible references from across the internet to find which of the 31,105 verses in the Bible were most popular. Now, who wants to guess what was the most popular verse last year in the Bible? John 3:16? No. Stunned me. Stunned the hell out of me. I'm sorry to talk like a Methodist, but it stunned me. The most sought for verse last year was Jeremiah 29:11. Robert, what does it say? Here it is. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Doesn't that break your heart? People going online to find the consolation in an ancient Hebrew text for the misfortunes and pain they're experiencing in America in the 21st century. And what is it they're seeking? Some protection against the insanity of the world, some hope, and get this, a future. Jeremiah 29:11 is the prayer of losers in the winner-take-all war of a political system that has been corrupted into the service of oligarchs and plutocrats, multimillionaires and billionaires, and the corporations that dominate the global economy. To win, those powers must control American politics as they have in the last 30 years, including both parties. A personal note here. As a young man, I was drawn to politics. I took part in 2 national campaigns in 1960 and 1964 and served 7 years in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. But since then, over my 50 years as a journalist, I saw both parties betray everyday Americans, the so-called ordinary man, the working people in this country, people like my father, Henry, and my mother, Ruby. And I began to understand what Thomas Jefferson meant back in 1789 when he wrote, "I'm not a Federalist because I never submitted the whole system of my opinions to the creed of any party of men, whether in religion, in philosophy, in politics, or anything else. If I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go at all." And of course, we know there will be no parties in heaven, no Democrats, no liberals, no conservatives, no socialists and libertarians, just us Baptists. Remember that statue in Chartres? End of detour. Do we realize? Do we grasp? Do we understand just how cruel our culture has become? Our most vital safety nets are frayed and fraying. The policies of our workplaces have turned against Henry and Ruby Moyers. Our quality of life is subjected to market-based metrics, the bottom line, and the relentless barrage of commercial propaganda to the point that it becomes difficult for the public to acknowledge the cost in human misery and everyday hardship for millions of people just struggling to survive, dreaming of a decent income, dreaming of dignity, dreaming of hope, a future, as Jeremiah says, for themselves and for the kids. As Rabbi Sachs said yesterday, and I'm paraphrasing, it's the people with faith in the future who bring children into the world. And if that faith is betrayed, democracy, in their sight and in the fact of lived experience, loses its legitimacy. Peter Beinart writes, the worse Americans fare, listen, the worse Americans fare in their own lives, the darker their view of the country. And he quotes Robbie Jones's outfit again, that white Republicans who seldom or never attend religious services are 19 points less likely to say the American dream holds true than white Republicans who attend at least once a week. And I'm still quoting, white Democrats who are disconnected from organized religion are substantially more likely than other white Democrats to call the American dream a myth. It's possible, Peter says, that losing faith in America's political and economic system leads one to lose faith in organized religion. But in either way, in 2016, the least religiously affiliated white Democrats, like the least religiously affiliated white Republicans, were the ones most likely to back candidates promising revolutionary change. In his book, Twilight of the Elites, the journalist Chris Hayes, now of MSNBC, divided Americans between the institutionalists who believe in preserving and adopting the present economic system and the insurrectionists who believe it's rotten to the core. And Beinart says the 2016 election represents an extraordinary shift in power from the institutionalist to the insurrectionist. What explains the loss? The shift? The loss of manufacturing jobs, the Iraq War, to which I would add the 16-year failed war in Afghanistan, the financial crisis, and a black president's inability to stop the police from killing unarmed African Americans. And then once again, disengagement from organized religion. Which brings me back to the millennials. And I will end shortly. I've talked to millennials, read the literature, followed the reporting and the journalism. I have millennials working for me. Their take on religion is about as myriad as their DNA, reminding me that you can't really talk about religion today without reckoning with the diversity and variety of belief and unbelief. I mean, everyone is different. There's no theologian who has superiority over any other theologian because of the varieties. Some millennials say they were never religious in the first place, and I believe that. Some just stopped believing in what they'd been taught as children. Some have been turned off by the clear hypocrisy of politicians who keep promising God bless America, who keep proclaiming God bless America while supporting endless war and policies that enrich the few at the expense of everyone else. Some left the Catholic Church for tolerating, then covering up the abuse of the children in the charge of the priest. And some have been turned off by the monster born of the coupling of politics and religion, because that involves coercion and that involves extremism. Some have been turned off, as we heard this week from Susan and others, by being exposed to the truth of our past through books, movies, documentaries, and the diffusion of general information as we come to grips at last with the myth of American exceptionalism. They now see what Susan meant this week by the Christianity of empire and by the God of state, the God of the state. How Christianity was profoundly implicated in slavery, genocide, and the subjugation of women. My father could become a deacon, even though he was one of the poorest men in town in that little church in East Texas. It was years later that I wondered, why wasn't my mother a deacon? Because the rules and regulations of the church I loved and that loved me subjugated women to the patriarchs whose loyalty was to a male white God. How Christianity was profoundly implicated in slavery, genocide, and the subjugation of women. How the Bible was invoked to persecute homosexuals and enforce Jim Crow laws, and to defend war, torture, and imperialism for the sake of the virulent capitalism that has produced the vast inequality that divides our country and our world. So I would submit that with millennials, and perhaps with others, the crisis with religion is not so much a crisis of faith as it is a crisis in faith. Millions of people, and not just the young, have stopped believing in belief. They don't care about doctrine, nor should they really. My good friend, the historian Martin Marty, who's been here before, has just written a short book I highly recommend. It's only 100 pages on the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. It was October of this year that Martin Luther nailed that thesis to that church door in Wittenberg and set off the Protestant Revolution. And doctrine was the issue. And then Martin Marty tells a story about the fellow in the 1820s who was chased, tarred and feathered, and chased out of the little town. As he got out of the little town, rescuers reached him and calmed him down and said, "What happened? Why were they trying to kill you?" And he said, "Well, it was because of the Monroe Doctrine." He said, "The Monroe Doctrine," said one of the rescuers. "What do you mean the Monroe Doctrine?" He said, "Well, I told them I was for the Monroe Doctrine. I told them I believed in the Monroe Doctrine. I lived by the Monroe Doctrine, and I would die for the Monroe Doctrine. I just told them I didn't know what was in it." And much of doctrine touches people that way. So I think the crisis that we've been discussing this week is not so much a crisis of faith as it is a crisis in belief. And as Rob Boston wrote in the magazine Free Inquiry, millennials are not discarding religion as much as they are simply defining it in new ways and feeling increasingly empowered to blend tradition to create in their image those communities of fellowship and purpose, as we heard this morning's lecture from Ebon, as well as to dispel the loneliness of being lost in a culture of libertarian hedonism, drowning in the deeply polluted ocean of commercialism which we navigate today as consumers, consuming the earth itself. The only home we have, we're eating up. Instead of citizens collaborating to create a functioning covenant, as Rabbi Sachs said yesterday, a functioning covenant of democracy, and as the petitioner to Jeremiah asks, a sustainable future. I am convinced the only way to break the hold of the cartel of ignorance and greed that governs our culture, our politics, and our economy, to combat the militarism, the materialism, and the racism that define the very notion of continent, as Rabbi Sachs said yesterday, is fellowship. I urge you not to underestimate the deep thirst for fellowship among a generation facing the extinction of life itself from the foolish belief of an ideology that says we can have it all now. Because when they know that when we have it, we have lost something profound and something sacred. That sense of brotherhood and sisterhood that is at the heart of our human experience. Young people today find meaning and purpose in fellowship. But don't we all? Not far from here in Buffalo, there's a Franciscan friar and chaplain named Judd Weixner. By coincidence, I came across an essay he wrote in the Buffalo News in response to Robbie Jones' survey last year, a survey with the title, quote, "Exodus, Why Americans Are Leaving Religion and Why They Are Unlikely to Come Back." Reverend Weixner says the rapid growth of the unaffiliated has hit Buffalo too. But what he writes about what is happening to many of the dropouts is fascinating as they experience, get this, slow roll bike riding. Slow roll Bachreichen. Now, I've never heard of that until I read this essay. But apparently it originated in Detroit and is spreading as a way for friends to gather on a regular basis, ride a city's wide boulevards, explore new neighbors, and above all, to be together, including over a cold beverage afterward. If that sounds like a club rather than a church, well, I suppose it is. But Reverend Waxner writes as a deeply committed member of a religious community, and he thinks he has discovered what he calls the spiritual aspects of cycling. Get this. What was it? A sense of inclusiveness. He said, you see people of all ages, 4 to 93, blind riders and their guides, deaf riders and the very young, as well as different races, nationalities, and ethnicities. He says that as they gather, he is reminded of a song found in most Catholic hymnals, "All are welcome," which made me think of that old American Protestant hymn, "Shall we gather? We gather." Not me. Shall we gather at the river? He says of slow biking, slow roll is not a religion. In fact, a great number of slow rollers are inactive, disengaged, or disinterested in organized religion. But there's solidarity. There's camaraderie. There's a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, and of social capital. The subject Rabbi Sachs brilliantly defined yesterday as the networks, plural, of relationship among people that enable a society to function with a rough sense of fairness and a firm commitment to justice. In other words, to be a true democracy, you need social capital. And the Reverend writes this, during a slow roll, you cannot ignore the sense that you are part of a body that moves as one, that has a purpose, that strives for the common good, and that knows how to celebrate. That knows how to celebrate. Do you ever stop to think how little shared joy there is in America today? That's what makes your 4th of July celebration here so splendid, so marvelous. Acknowledging that America is a broken experiment, but still rich in promise for all if we live up to the prologue to the Constitution. When I went back to our room that night, I had a weird experience. After the 4th of July celebration, because on my mind was the symphony, the performance of Beethoven's Ninth on the Saturday night before. How many of you were there? Okay. And I asked myself, why do we keep stepping on our joy? Why do we keep denying ourselves what is in our heart of hearts we really want? Truly a more perfect union, a saner society, a safe future for ourselves, our kids, and everyone. I'm convinced that there are few human beings who feel really content, satisfied as a human being if they're the only one in the neighborhood who is safe and secure, well-housed, well-fed, and well-clothed. And why do we keep stepping on our lives together, our desire to live our lives together? Judith and I were there at that performance. You know, it was just incredible to experience what happened as the bass summoned our attention, and then the middle brass picked up the song, and then the violins came in with their sweeping beauty, and then the drums and percussion added the oomph to it. And when I went home that night, I thought of something I'd forgotten for a long time. In the late 70s, I was the senior correspondent for CBS Reports, the famous documentary series founded by Edward R. Murrah. And one of my first assignments was to go to southern Rhodesia, a landlocked country next to South Africa and others in Africa. They were in a struggle for independence from Britain. This was a big story for us in America because what happened there would probably inflect other countries in that region. And so I went to do a documentary. It was an apartheid country. Blacks were second class, third class, and fourth class citizens, couldn't vote, couldn't walk the streets at night, couldn't shop in the markets or the stores. They were really living as American blacks had lived, under the coercion of the state. And what happened to apartheid was a big issue. So I went there, planning to spend most of a month, and the first night I was there, went to bed because of jet lag, and at midnight I was awakened by, I'd left the radio on, the national state radio on, and I was awakened by the sound of Beethoven's Ninth, the Ode to Joy. My heart beat, and I was thrilled by it, and suddenly it occurred to me, this was their national anthem. And they wrote new words to it. "O rise, people of Rhodesia. O rise, people of Rhodesia," but not blacks, not most of the population. They had taken this beautiful tribute of this beautiful celebration of our capacity for fellowship and our capacity for community and our mostly capacity for joy, and turned it into a tool of an impressive state. That's the dissonance in religion. That's the conflict we have to wrestle with. That's the resolution we have to make. And the night that the amphitheater rocked with the vibrations of Ode to Joy, I remembered that I thought the future is open. It is our choice. We have to take sides. We can choose which side of our nature to nurture, but we have to take sides. And when the church, and when the synagogue, and when the cathedral, and when the little church in Marshall, Texas, when they take the right side for God, for truth, for the deplorables Jesus brought around him, faith, faith, faith will live. Thank you.
Bill Moyers, we thank you. You are America's journalist of the soul, but more than a journalist, as I listened to you rhapsodize in those last 5 minutes on Beethoven's Ninth, you are also a poet. And Voltaire said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So we need the law giving and the vision that you provide. Bill, how do you want to handle? You identified a number of questioners. I'm going to yield and ask that you provide some guidance on how you'd like to proceed.
Were you on the list of people who didn't get asked the other? Is anyone here who was on that list? Wait a minute, I have it.
Those should come forward, please.
Sorry, I just trust you. It's in the other black notebook. Sorry about that. We'll start right here.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comments on all the comments before. In faith of establishments and so forth, one of the establishments I'm beginning to question my faith in is the Supreme Court in ruling in a way that would be helpful. Your comments.
What's the issue is what decisions would the court make that would undermine faith?
And what they might do in the future, considering the present.
Well, I think the court is definitely going to be moving more to the conservative, the right side. President Trump's nomination of Gorsuch right out of the bat pleased and appeased the Christian right that had voted for him. And I'm told that he has another 100+ list of names to go on the lower courts, and that every one of them, or most of them, have been vetted by the Christian right. So you can expect a series of decisions in behalf of those requests and petitions that the Christian right has integrated into the platform of the Republican Party. I mean, they want the state, since they cannot persuade enough people that the right of a woman to her own reproductive freedom is right. They failed at persuading the public of that. So they're going to have to ask the court to use the powers to allow the government to use its powers of coercion to deny a woman the right of responsibility for her own body. They want they're having a hard time, many conservative churches, as many liberal churches are, in their finances. They want the government to help with subsidies and other financial rewards that relieve them. They, if they could, they would see the court reverse its decision in behalf of marriage equality. So I think in all of those, I mean, I saw a 21-page document the other day by a conservative think tank justifying inequality on biblical grounds. And they are not going to do anything, and they would like for the court to continue its path of preventing campaign finance reform, because that's one way they will eventually, they hope, with Secretary DeVos and others, to get state coercion of financial support for their program enshrined in government, in law. So that's where it's going.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Actually, the principal thing that I would like to do is to be able to thank you publicly for bringing us the best that television has to offer for many years.
Thank you, and I want to do this. Judith, would you stand up? That's for you too. Just stand up for a moment.
I think of you both as prophets of our age. And what I mean by that is truth tellers. And I was reminded why I think this. We miss that you are no longer doing this, and we're privileged that we get to hear it this afternoon. This afternoon was a perfect example of being the truth teller.
You want a short answer to that?
Actually, the thing that I'd like to do, too, is to invite you to talk about another shift, major shift in the country over the past decades, and that is the movement of opportunity, jobs, the intellectual elite to our big cities, and particularly those on the East and West Coast. I would even think you're probably an example of that. Someone who grew up in Marshall, Texas. I don't happen to know where you live now, but I would guess New York, Washington would be likely possibilities. I'm an example of that too, in that my family for years grew up and lived near Henderson, Texas, and now I live in Boston. Could you weave that into the
Well, it's inevitable, because in the whole history of the human race, as soon as they could, people moved to the cities where there was a critical mass of transportation, trade, and merchanting. And so people went to where the opportunities were. I went to Washington because that's where the United States government was, and I wanted to be a political journalist. But people go where the opportunities are. And, you know, when people say we should return to the farming, of the good old days of farming, I ask them, were you ever a farmer? And no one really wants to work that way if they can avoid it. So the cities have and the more people you have, the more artists, the larger the congregations. It's just a law of nature that mass creates opportunity and cities create mass. And that's why it's been. And now technology, which developed in Silicon Valley, has drawn many, many young people out there, people we know, and back to New York, because Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn have become new Silicon Valleys. And that's the story. I don't think people said, let's all move to the city. I just think individually, one by one, they went to where they thought. Actors could act, and writers could find publishers, and journalists could be on television and produce. I think that's the answer to the question.
Thank you.
Yes.
I need your help. My wife and I are having a dispute. The dispute is this, that I think this week should be called a crisis in religion, because I think there's a difference between faith and religion. She says, no, they're the same thing. So would you please tell her she's wrong?
Judith and I had a case like that about 35 years ago, if I remember. No, I wouldn't. What I would say is not an authoritative answer. I do agree with Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great writer of transcendentalism, a pioneer in developing American religion, who wrote 150 years ago that God, as he understands the phenomenon, is the ideal to which we direct our lives. That's choice, ethics, and some would call it faith. I have faith that if I direct my ideal in that direction, I will become a better, fuller person. Religion is the effort of people who are doing that in different ways with different goals, except to try to satisfy God's ideal. That religion is the exercise of organization and efforts and education and instruction that grows up around faith. And I'll accept that. I mean, religion is the effort you make with others to create a congregation, a church, a fellowship, a social agency, or whatever. And I think that's my answer to that.
So can you separate the two?
Yes. You don't have to become involved in working with other people to organize a body for your faith, to be part of a fellowship that is trying collectively to carry out what you cannot do by yourself.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I wrote this down so I'd be succinct, and if Dr. Franklin would weigh in on this question too, I'd appreciate it. Women are underrepresented in ministry in many mainline religious organizations, most notably Catholics, Jewish Orthodox, Southern Baptist Convention. In 2012, National Congregational Study of White Conservatives, Fundamentalists, Evangelicals found that 2.9% of leadership roles went to women. Coupled with the pervasive use of masculine language in reference to God, I wonder if we, the body of religious organizations, have somehow laid the groundwork for an environment of misogyny. And have we laid the groundwork then for the disassociation of the millennials as well as nurturing this environment? Would you be inclined to share your thoughts on the political and generational precipitates of the underrepresentation of women in leadership roles in organized religions and the lack of use of feminine imagery for the divine?
Well, that's a well thought out question for which I do not have either the time or the wisdom to answer shortly, or perhaps even in a longer take. I do know that historically, at some point in history, after the goddesses were removed from power in the mythologies of pagan lands, males liked the result. Paternalism set in. And then laws were written and enforced that perpetuated the patriarchy. All organizations tend to perpetuate the values and prejudices of the owners or the managers or the executives. So misogyny became an instrument of repression to make sure that the females in the organization, in the town, in the church, never got the power to reverse course. That little church I told you about, those were good men who were the deacons and the pastors. They just didn't want to give up their position, their privilege, and their power. It was convenient to have women serve Wednesday night supper, but not ever challenge the congregation in a Sunday sermon. It was just convenient. Whites in the South, my white brethren and sisters, discovered that white supremacy was a wonderful system if you were white and supreme. And so for many, there was no prejudice involved. There was just a practice that was very rewarding to their power, their position. So they wrote the laws. that perpetuated the way things were. And as a result of not ever having that chance to govern and that chance to enact legislation and that chance to speak in the public square in behalf of public policy, women were disarmed in a way. You know, if you tie your right arm to you for a year, you will not be able to use your right arm again. So women in that effect, I mean intellectually, I'm oversimplifying, were disarmed from the expectation and the use of the offices of state and the instruments of culture that men loved to dominate. There's no doubt in my mind about your capacity, no doubt in my mind about your superiority of insight. No, I'm serious on that. And the fact that you see the world so differently from someone below than from someone above. And I welcome, Judith was the first feminist I knew. And while that's sometimes been discomforting, it is nonetheless necessary. And it relieves men from the pretense that we were ever as good as we said we were. So I think this new day is coming. It's going to be tough because the election of 2016 was definitely a defeat for women. Yes. So, all right.
Okay. I was on your list, and my question was for the humanist fellow, but I'll pitch it to you anyway. And he was a very rational guy, and humanism is rational thought. Listened to Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Schwartz, very rational discussions, a lot of it very rational. But in my, and I'm a scientist, I'm all over rational, I love it. But as I've aged, I've come to realize there are two ways of gathering information. One is rational, one is intuitive. One learning through your gut, learning through emotion, learning through interaction with people. But we haven't had much of that discussion. And I'm curious, how do we bring and honor that kind of learning? Because I think it was an absence of that kind of learning that profoundly affected the way the election went. And so much of our discussion this week that we don't as a society honor that kind of learning.
There is a vast and very effective backlash against 400 years of the Renaissance, that great flowering of science and knowledge, and starting around 1600, and the Enlightenment, which came 100 or so years later in politics, science, and culture. And it loosened the mind from the authority of the church. It loosened the explorer from the boundaries of a fixed map. It opened the way for women to write and be published and that sort of thing. And that has accumulated, accentuated by the election of a black president who represented the fulfillment in one sense of what the America added to that long trend in 2008 with the first black president. I asked Lyndon Johnson the night that the Voting Rights Act was signed in 1965, do you think this will mean a black president in our time? He said, oh, no. No, he said, it won't be a black president. Too much ignorance, too much bias, too much history. But there will be a woman in our time. But he knew both of them were, and he did know both of them would represent an exclamation point behind the forces that had been let loose 300, 400, 500 years ago. And that's what we're experiencing. Science is among them. Feminism is among them. Equality for blacks and the downtrodden, the subjugated, that's part of it. And the election last year was a reaction to a 4-century change. You know, and that's why I won't be around to see it. In the long run, it can go the other way. It can go the way Nazi Germany went, or Berlusconi's Italy or South America. It can go to fascism. It can go to authoritarianism. In the long run, though, I think historically this mighty force that overturned what we were talking about, the structural institutions in thought, habit, and political and social organization, that's what we're running into. And
don't you think
it will have its heyday for the next 2 or 3 years, but then we have to hope the trend gets back in lockstep.
Yeah. But don't you think we've gotten out of balance?
Absolutely.
Rational.
You're never going to change that altogether. There was a famous study done at the University of Michigan, I think, over 5 years, showing that if you are confronted, if the people in the survey were confronted with a fact that challenged their belief system, they would always vote for the belief system. And they hope, because beliefs are what we live by. Values are what we live by. We don't live by facts. Facts help us live, but we don't live by them. Men did not land on Normandy for a fact. They landed for the belief in freedom. So beliefs will prevail. We have to keep countering them and keep changing, improving the educational process so that kids coming out of high school today and college are aware that life is dual. We must have beliefs and values, but we must also have facts that define reality. What's happening right now is this terrible effort to define a new reality based upon belief and not on facts. Okay, one more, and then we'll quit.
I'd like to ask you a question that I asked Arlie Hochschild, because it's really more your bailiwick. And we were listening to Robert Reich talking about an experience he had in a PBS discussion program. And he said, I kept getting this message from the producer in my earbud that I should be getting angry. And he said, but I wasn't angry. But they kept telling me I should be angry. And so my question is this: to what extent do you think the divisiveness that we're experiencing in our politics and in much of our national life right now is being driven by the media's need for entertainment?
I'll talk to Charlie Rose when I get back about that. That would not be the voice of Judith, which was always in my ear from the control room where she sat during the taping, because that's not our way. But yes, about 35 or 40 years ago, when 60 Minutes began to do some sensational stories, and the ratings shot up, the powers that be in advertising and television decided that emotions, sensations, attracted more viewers, and more viewers meant higher ratings, and higher ratings meant more advertising, and that's when CBS News, of which I was a part, lost its status as a loss leader. Bill Paley, who was the president of CBS, tolerated CBS reports sending me to South Africa to report on a story most people didn't care about in this country. But after that, they didn't want to pay for that kind of expensive documentary when they could spend much less money and have much higher ratings and therefore much more revenue from reality TV. Donald Trump became a public celebrity because of reality TV. And it made a huge sum of money for NBC, which was then run by Jeff Zucker, who now runs CNN, which Donald Trump has called the enemy of the state. No question about it. When entertainment fused with news and news became profitable as entertainment, it was the beginning of the end for the kind of journalism that Judith and I do. When's the last time you have seen a serious documentary in an hour of primetime television? I mean, one that deals with power and the corruption of the parties and how the system in Congress is rigged, and how the banks are back capable of doing and are authorized to do what they did that brought us down 8 years ago. You haven't seen one on commercial networks, and not all that many except for Frontline on PBS. Thank you. I'm sorry about this, but we'll try to get to you in the next one. I'm not in charge of the clock. Thank you.
Thank you again, Bill.